Hey everyone, my name is Amit Patel. I'm a managing director with Integ. Um, Sorry, there's a question, Samuel. Sure, yeah, if you can just post any questions in the Q&A, that'd be great, please. So yeah, my name is Amit Patel. I'm a managing director with Integ, and pretty much I work with a lot of utilities. I work with independent power producers. I work with cooperatives, and I also work with O&M providers. So pretty much, as well as regulators, we do a lot of software for all of those segments, including the regulators, ISOs. We're looking forward to the discussion. Sharon, you want to introduce yourself?
Or, excuse me, I'm Sharon Brown. I'm an energy operations consultant. Um, I come from the synchronous generation side of the fence for many years, and then I dabbled in renewables. Right now, I'm supporting Merck Pharmaceutical in their utility and energy operations on their team. Um, Really heavily involved with ESG and sustainability, as well as obviously plant operations. So just happy to be here. Great group on this panel.
Scott?
I'm Scott Carpiel. I'm a principal applications engineer for SMA America. We're an inverter manufacturer. I've been in renewables for about 15 years now. My primary role is technical support for EPCs, developers, owners, utilities, and along with that, I'm on our team of engineers, colleagues that are keeping in touch and involved with all of these standards and working groups. And I'm kind of in the middle of them in trying to pull everybody together to understand how our product is going to meet the requirements as needed for these new standards that are coming down the pike or have recently been approved.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. It's really interesting to have OEM providers on here. It's great to get your input as well. Like I said, we do more of the software. We have Sharon, who's a kind of industry compliance person, and then we've got Scott as well, and then we've got Carlos, who is also represents Nextera, and he's Carlos. Why don't you go next? Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
I appreciate it, Ahmed, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Carlos Morales, I work with Nextera Energy. I help lead our SIP compliance program across the entire enterprise. We have a footprint that spans really all of the United States. We're in all of the NERC ERO regions. And so I have the unique vantage point and also really opportunity to build true enterprise process around SIP compliance with a focus on cybersecurity and physical security. So as we're thinking about these new standards that are coming down the pipe, how do we make sure that we put the proper protections in place, both physical and logical, to ensure that we're operating safely and we're keeping the grid as secure and as reliable as possible? That's my purview. Thank you.
Awesome. I think we're ready to get started, and just let everybody know I just enabled the chat. So when I was asking everybody to say where they're from, you wouldn't have been able to anyway. So, all right. I'm going to control the deck. So I'll let Amit, you let me know when you want to move forward, or any of the folks in the panel, let me know when you want to move forward, and I can do that.
Sure. So as we get started, we're gonna, there's been a lot of movement with what's going on with FERC Order 901. So we'll kind of get into the current state of everything that's going on. And we'll also mention, IEEE 2800, that's really important. The focus for us, though, is more for the generator owners and owner operators. So we'll be reviewing O&P reliability standards from that aspect. And then we'll kind of, towards the end of this, talk about what the action plan is for generators as well. So, hey, Mike, good to see you on here. Thanks for posting where you're from. So, all right, Adam, we can move on. sorry, it's still next slide, Adam.
Hold on, I don't know why it's not actually changing the slides for you guys, but it's changing them for me. So give me a second.
Sure.
Always something with these. All right. Let's see. How about that?
Yep, there we go. So yeah, a little bit about Integ, and we're not going to get into this, but why we like to feature this is we do compliance, and a lot of what we do is automation around compliance. And we're specifically going to be focusing on IBR operations. So a lot of what we're doing is automated evidence collections, automated logging, as well as manual if needed. And what we really do is to automate this, we auto detect conditions, and where we can do automated logging and evidence collections, we'll do it. But where we also need to supplement with any manual workflow to say, hey, I called transmission, I did this, I did that, that only a manual person can do, then we also send that. And then we also do a ton of the out of box reporting. So again, we're not going to focus on this at all, but if you are interested, there's an email on the bottom, or you can get in touch with myself or Adam through LinkedIn or, email. So let's move on, Adam. All right, Scott, you want to talk a little bit about SMA here, please?
Sure. So SMA is one of the leaders in the renewable energy for both PV and storage. We've got over 40 years of experience. We've got more than 155 gigawatts of capacity installed. Globally, that is 40 plus gigawatts of central or Sunny Central or PV inverters, 16 plus gigawatts of our Sunny Central storage BESS or battery energy storage system inverters. We've got over 1,600 patents. We've been bankable and publicly traded in the German stock market since 2008, and best-in-class reliability, service, and support. Our current product is one design for IEC as well as IEEE or UL US divisions, including the UL listing and Canadian CUL listings. It's a turnkey solution for the lowest cost, for shortest time in installation and commissioning. It's modular, so it's got flexibility. It's lowest specific cost thanks to the higher power classes. Since it's on a 20-foot container, it is easy to transport, and no special transport needs are needed. And then, as I mentioned, the standards involvements with PRCs, everything that's happening with NERC FERC Order 901. Then obviously 2800 is a hot topic. Things that are happening in ERCOT or Texas are also a hot topic. So as well as we have experience going all the way back to the development of 1547, 2018. Specifically, I was on one of the working groups for that. So we've been involved with a lot of these standards and working groups for a long time. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and happy to be part of the team. The group.
Great. All right, so let's move on.
So this is just a quick picture of our current product. It's a standard 20-foot container. We've got the different power classes for PV as well as storage. I also want to point out in the bottom left, we do have grid forming technology available that we're happy to support any grid forming projects you may have. So feel free to reach out to your local SMA sales managers or applications engineers for more information. Thank you.
All right, so I think there's been a lot going on, and stuff just happened very recently in the last week. So what we're going to do is talk about what's changed, right? The current state of the NERC reliability standards and grid operator requirements. So let's move into the next slide and talk a little bit about that. All right, so Scott and Sharon, jump in as I'm talking through this. But so as far as standards, we have 901, right? And really, I guess Scott, you want to chime in on what just happened with the latest, with what's going on?
I'll defer to Sharon. She was in the meeting.
Sure, or Sharon. I'm sorry, that was.
I'm going to defer to Sharon on that.
So obviously, FERC has ordered, FERC Order 901 directed NERC to do certain things with their reliability standards, to basically address inverter-based resources and their performance during ride-through. doing events, grid disturbance events, and to actually monitor the arrive-throughs. I didn't say this earlier, but I come from a NERC compliance background, but with a real bite into the operations. So we are all familiar with the protection standards, the PRC standards, and obviously NERC, as a result of the FERC order, started their development process and the standards development, reliability standards development to comply with the FERC order. So what came out of that were several projects going on. Specifically, they had projects that addressed disturbance monitoring and reporting requirements for inverter-based resources. That was PRC 28, that they had a red line document. And they went through the balloting process. If you don't know, NERC goes through a very rigorous development, and there's a consensus organization in terms of how they do their rulemaking. So the regulated community is they're active participants in helping these rules come and take their shape. So these three standards, like I said, PRC 28, 028, 29, which is the frequency and voltage ride-through requirements for inverter-based and generator resources. And then 30 was the unexpected inverter-based resource event mitigation standard. I was on a call yesterday. A lot is happening, and something unprecedented happened. Basically, NERC went through a process of balloting for these three standards. And with regard to PRC 28, it passed. And they're going to do some more things with it, but 29 did not. So the frequency and voltage ride-through requirements for IBRs, that standard is kind of up in the air. Not in the air in that they don't know what to do. They have a plan of attack, but it's something unprecedented where they didn't receive 2/3 the votes on the ballots to basically have it move forward and be ready for this November witching hour, November 2024, which is when they agreed to have certain standards filed with FERC. 30 passed as well, and they got 76% on the balloting, and on the implementation plan, 85%. And then they also did some things to the NERC rules of procedure that spoke to the actual definitions of inverter-based resources, IBR units, and they basically the definitions, the IBR definitions, passed as well. So Scott and I were kind of chewing the fat before you guys jumped on the call with us, and on this Department of Energy call yesterday, ESIG, they had it was a great panel, and they gave us a lot of the background and where we were our way forward with these standards. And essentially, because 29 did not pass, this is unprecedented, and we're kind of backed into a corner. NERC has to meet certain deadlines to comply with the FERC Order 901. And so they have 2 paths that they can take. They're going to do a technical conference, and that's scheduled, I believe, in September. But they have the option of doing the notice of NOPR path, which is basically how they form their rules, their rulemaking. And they could theoretically have their board could direct NERC to revise and submit the revision to 28 with no balloting. So that's a possibility, but they definitely don't want to do that. That's not like something that they prefer. They like to have the regulated community involved. So that's kind of a quick and dirty of the status of the standards. And just for the record, it's not going to be like on November 30th that everybody has to comply with the standards that pass the balloting. There's going to be a phased in implementation of the standards.
All right, great. Thank you, Sharon. And yeah, so there's also IEEE 2800, which you know,
So
things like,
Annette, I can
go ahead. Yeah, why don't you talk a little bit to that, Scott?
some of the ISOs, the ISOs like are already looking at 2800. We know that this is not going to be a standard that is requiring a certification from a nationally recognized testing laboratory. This is going to be more of a self-declaration for 2800. There's a lot happening here. It's a very large document. There's a lot of technical requirements. If you've been following it, you'll know that 2800.2, which is the testing requirements for the body of the document, is not yet released. So there's a lot of things that are unknown as to how to test to make that self-declaration. But what we're seeing is certain ISOs, especially MISO, already starting to adopt MISO and the New York ISO, starting to adopt portions of 2800 that they think are beneficial or necessary for their network. So when it comes to who's adopting this, even though it's not a certification process, even though it's a self-declaration process, even though it doesn't have a testing document, we are seeing interconnection agreements with certain requirements coming out of 2800.
So I wanted to chime in too on IEEE 2800. I went and kind of did a quick and dirty standard study of exactly. I've worked with all of the ISOs as a consequence of being a NERC compliance director for companies that had assets, and we were DO and GOP all across the country. So essentially, every single one of them like Scott said, to a greater degree, MISO is very and has really leaned into IEEE 2800. The Cal ISO, they have the voltage ride through, frequency response, data reporting, and they, again, like Scott said, in the LGIAs, they basically define, what pieces of it they want to have the generator owners comply with. SPP, reactive power support, ERCOT, transient overvoltage is a big component. And again, their tariff filings and the LGIA kind of stipulate terms. And for PJM, the same thing, voltage phase angle, they're pulling from IEEE 2800. New York ISO, like Scott just said, and ISO New England voltage support. But PJM, New York ISO under frequency response is a big one with them, as well as over frequency response and performance monitoring. So every single ISO RTO, they have with varying degrees pulled pieces of the IEEE 2800 standard and help with this particular topic of IBR ride-through performance too. So in addition to NERC, you have the industry standard.
It's a good point, Sharon, because it makes things very difficult for OEMs and owners and operators when different locations and different ISOs have different requirements in trying to keep up what each individual entity is doing within their own territory. So you really have to pay attention to those LGIAs, those interconnection applications agreements, as to what your plant operational needs requirements are, especially when it comes to these events that we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, so just speaking a little bit to the earlier slide, the owner operators are kind of stuck waiting for everything to kind of hash out, because there's going to be a lot of, folks they're going to have to satisfy if things get split, right? So it's going to be interesting. And as software vendors, we're kind of waiting as well for everything to hash out. So really now the question comes in, if you are a generator owner operator, right? How are these going to affect you? Really, no matter what happens, thinking is that, look, from a standpoint collection, likely more data is going to need to be collected. Now, before we were thinking it was going to be more at the inverter level. Now that may not necessarily be the case, though that's not going to hurt. Modeling is going to be huge, right? Continuous review. You have to make sure that, what's modeled reflects reality. So there's going to have to be kind of a continuous feedback loop. And when you do this, right, you should really be careful that this is something that's going to make sense when you do the initial modeling, because it's way more critical than it's ever been. And then you're going to have systems to do auditing to be able to comply with all of these things, right? So for example, can you capture ride-through performance? If you have an audit, can you say, hey, why did X, Y, and Z happen? Who did what, right? So it's not just getting the data points, but it's being able to tell a story using that. And with IBRs, there's just too much data. So it's not telling a story. Most likely a lot of this will need to be automated to simplify, because I don't think it's something that folks are going to be able to do the same way you could do with fossil. So Scott or Sharon, I don't know if you had anything to add here. Or Carlos. You know, and one point I will make that Carlos is going to talk about is security, which I'm not talking about here, but I think it's implicit.
So, just to kind of piggyback on what you just said, Amit, one of the things that everybody focuses on is, the NERC reliability standard and the compliance piece is super important on the OMP side, the PRC standard for this particular thing. And obviously, Carlos is going to talk to the SIP side. But the one thing that I want to drive home here is that, and Amit, you touched on it, the more data you gather, and obviously data is a function of your fault recording, your the disturbance monitoring equipment, your sequence of event recording, all of that data is not only helps you with your compliance check mark or checking a box for compliance, but also in how you build the model, refine the model of your site to like reflect what it really is doing. So the data is important, not just from a compliance piece, but I call it a continuous improvement piece on how you operate.
Yeah, it really is a risk management game, right? So auditing less and less, you'll see the ERO go from, traditionally, years ago, to a check the box type of, execution against these standards. And that just doesn't exist anymore. The audit teams that we interact with across the ERO really have made a shift, to their credit, to risk-based auditing. And when we talk about auditing, traditionally we've thought about it from just in response mode to an audit team coming in and asking for evidence and us telling us our stories. And really, that's just half the equation. Right. The other half of it is really understanding, how are you managing risk internal to your company, independent of any auditor coming in and looking at your shop and your program. It's really understanding how are you managing your risk. And a lot of that comes with just following your processes, having a high say-do ratio with respect to what your program says you're going to do and how you manage that risk. So just keep that in mind when you guys think about auditing and these new standards coming down the pipeline. The real question that I know we're asking at Nextera, and I offer to industry just for thought, is, what kind of continuous monitoring program are you putting in place to ensure that your program is operating as designed? That's really, when I think about that auditing bucket, that's where my mind goes. It's, kind of half the battle between that and continuous monitoring.
One of my mentors, when I first got into renewables, was asking a customer, what are you doing to ensure you can keep the lights on? Right. And it stuck with me all these years, that one little statement of what we're doing, how we're doing it, especially now when we're getting the higher penetration levels of IBRs. It's going to become more and more important to understand how we're going to keep those lights on. And that comes all back to these reliability pieces that we're working on, that these standard reliability standards that we're working on, the monitoring, the data recording, the evaluation, the modeling, it all comes into play.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, Adam, go ahead. You can move on. So yeah. And Carlos, to your point, what we're seeing also now as we do this, is that the compliance isn't happening more towards the end. We're making sure that, as a risk or compliance event happens, we try to make sure that we find it and dispatch the workflow, because your operators, all those folks, you want to know everything as much ahead of time as possible, right? And it's more holistic and organic, and we're trying to make sure that the operations folks and the operations centers are as involved as possible. But you can't make them fill out 100 forms. You just have to tell them when something happens, and if you can do it in that way where you're not bothering them, because they've also have to do operations. So it's a balance that you have to really work out. But I see your job's going to get harder and harder.
Yeah, it really is a balance. Data can be a double-edged sword, and Sharon alluded to it earlier. Having a lot of data can be a great thing, but it also can kind of handcuff you a bit in the event that your processes don't allow you to ingest that data in an easy way. The last thing we want our operators to be doing is focusing on just activities that just check the box on compliance. They really should be focused on keeping the lights on, and the product of their work daily should equal compliance. So telling that story, that compliance story after the fact, really is, it should be, folks like me and Sharon, just kind of telling the story versus focusing on trying to check the box at the end of a process. The auditors are talking about internal controls more and more now. I come from a financial industry background before energy, and it's almost like we're playing catch up as a utility industry when the internal control discussion is on board, right? And so when we start thinking about internal controls, it's not for auditors. They're not asking us those questions because of, it's helping their audit in any way. It's really mostly giving us an opportunity to think about our programs and where we can be more preventative and inject detective controls along the process.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a huge shift, and I think budgets are really going to need to shift to do all of this, because it's a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work. So, all right, Adam. Yeah, sorry. Good.
So on the next slide, Amit, one of the things that I wanted to kind of, okay.
The one before this, Adam, sorry.
I wanted to speak to the NERC alert that we had up on screen a minute ago. It's due next month. Okay, so next month, the regulated community already knows they gotta come correct with data, or not data so much, but you should be in a position already where you kind of have modeled how your assets perform. And IBR assets are no different from synchronous in terms of you're still putting electrons into the grid. You need to be sure that the models that you put together accurately reflect what's going on in the real world, in terms of how your site performs when you have grid disturbances. So one of the great things about Integ's data platforms and their platform, that their data pipeline software, their software management, I like that. That's why I was drawn to talking to Amit, because I looked at their products, and one of the things that I like is that you can collect data until the cows come home, but if you don't have a way to properly do the analytics, to capture it, to secure it, to use it to inform how you operate your sites, and that's what the models do. Help you figure out if you're doing things according to what's good and decent order when it comes to a grid disturbance. So next month is a kind of a witching hour too, in terms for the regulated community, in terms of these standards, and that FERC order 901. This came out of the NERC alert to deal with the IBR model quality and deficiencies. So you gotta, if you have assets and you've done modeling, you need to have that model continuously improved to reflect how your site is performing. And there's a NERC alert where you have a response due next month.
Great, thank you for that, Sharon. All right, so yeah, again, super critical. And even with these systems, what we're finding is that you have to do this more and more ad hoc, you know, those days where you could just do the software and you're done and, you know, you have releases once or twice a year, it's getting, you know, that model even doesn't work anymore because things are moving so quickly. So there's a ton of requirements for doing a lot of this ad hoc and being able to connect to multiple systems. So, all right, let's move on to the next slide. Adam, the other way, sorry. Yep. So yeah, Sharon, if you want to just summarize this real quick.
Sure. So with PRC 28, basically disturbance monitoring and reporting, it leads into the whole purpose of it is to ensure adequate data is available for IBRs to facilitate analysis. So there are things, there's hardware that needs to be installed at pivotal places throughout the site. And I think what came out of this particular standard was that where this equipment is expensive, and depending on the size of the site, depending on, you know, the you're going to have to install fault monitoring equipment if you don't already have it. And so you have this disturbance monitoring equipment at these different locations, fault recording, sequence of events reporting. And the whole purpose of the data collection is so that you can glean details about disturbances, collect the data on IBR performance during a grid disturbance, and also validate your ride-through capabilities. So you want to use this disturbance monitoring data to identify and address any performance issues. Again, yeah, this is a compliance task now, but to be honest, any developer and owner of a site, I shouldn't say developers because the developers have off-takers. Any owner of a site, IBR, you know, inverter-based resource, they really should be ensuring that this data is used to inform and improve performance. Because what we can't have are uncoupling or entities uncoupling from the grid at the first sign of a blip. Yeah, you can't carry like a synchronous generation, like a big frame unit with all that metal spinning, the inertia. You can't ride through a fault like a gas turbine or frequency, you know, they kind of carry it. But because of, like Scott mentioned, the amount of penetration in certain markets, particularly like ERCOT, literally it's no longer an option for folks just to drop off and go, okay, we had a fault.
Right.
We're disconnecting the grid.
That's the way it used to be, right?
Yeah, well,
here,
that dog don't hunt, as my grandmother used to say, anymore. And FERC has seen, we saw with the various disturbances, but the implications are vast for the grid if that happens, grid reliability. So that's basically 28 deals with the equipment, is disturbance monitoring and the reporting for IBR.
Thanks, Scott.
Additionally,
Thanks, Scott. Did you want to add anything?
yes, please. Additionally, it's also there, as it says in the text, for model validation, right? To confirm that your plant behaved as the model did, or if it didn't, why not? And then you move into the requirements of PRC 030 of mitigation. So the data collection is a very important part of keeping the lights on.
Yeah, Scott, you want to, I think this is also something, if you could speak to this slide.
Sure. So this is from the PRC 28 that was just passed, and specifically to the IBR unit, so the inverter unit itself, and kind of shifted a lot of those requirements off of the inverter to the collection circuit breaker. Really, the only thing that's required now by the inverter-based unit is really, as you see in 1.21 through 1.24, and fault codes, fault alarms, mode status, well, voltage ride-through mode status, frequency ride-through mode status, and then for units that are already in commercial operation before the effective date of the standard, it's if capable. So a lot of these older first generation inverters, wind generators, they're not necessarily capable of recording all of this. So there is a bit of an out, I guess, for some of the existing equipment, the older equipment, so that the expenses to the generation owners is tried to keep to a minimum so they don't have to replace the equipment. However, if they have to replace the equipment because of a failure or repower, then they have to be able to meet the requirements of 1.2.
Okay, but Scott, when you say failure, that's the entire plant, or what does this mean? It's unclear. Like, if you have a, solar plant with a bunch of inverters, what?
So if you have a bunch of inverters in a plant and say that inverter needs to be replaced for some reason, so there's some sort of internal failure on there. Now, the standard says that now that new inverter that you put into place has to be able to meet the new requirements.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh.
Now, there's a bit of confusion, I think, still, especially on my part, of if I have 100 inverters and I have to replace one, now my one inverter has to meet 1.2, but my 99 don't, according to the standard. Unless I'm repowering the entire site, now the entire site has to be upgraded, make sure that it meets requirements for data collection for IBRs that are in operation after the effective date. I know that was a lot to absorb there, but it's basically moving you from 1.3 into 1.2.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. That's huge if you just have a couple of inverters out, and if you've got 100. So yeah, that's.
And
But we
some
are
of the
seeing we are seeing complete sites being repowered because some of the manufacturers that were around 10 years ago aren't around today.
Oh,
So
geez.
they can't get replacement parts. They can't get maintenance. There's no maintenance out there. They can't get replacement parts. So they're going through what we call a repowering in the industry of repowering. So now, once they do that, if it's after the effective date, they need to make sure that the new equipment, whether it's the inverter, the collection circuit breaker, a relay up at the MPT, doesn't matter. But once you replace that piece of equipment, it has to meet the new requirements. And I believe that's the same way with 029 or PRC 29 and 28 will depend on your agreement, the LGIA. 2800, excuse me, will depend on the LGIA.
Sure. No worries. All right, so thank you, Scott. That's great. Let's move on. So 29 did not pass, and for now, I think what we're going to do is, Sharon, are we okay? I think time-wise, do we want to skip through this?
I just wanted to quickly say with regard to 29 that again they have this I want to make sure I'm not using the wrong verbiage, but basically even though it didn't pass, there's expected to get passed.
Okay.
I don't think they're gonna throw their hands up. NERC has to comply with the FERC order 901, so something's gonna happen. Someone said Libran. I can't read it because my eyes are bad.
29 is passed by imposing Rule 321.
Okay, right. So that was one of the things that came out of that meeting yesterday with DOE and ESIG. They mentioned that exact thing. But what I wanted to point out quickly with 29 is this, that the whole point of it is to again to collect the data to demonstrate that you can do the right frequency and voltage ride-through. And so it establishes the ride-through performance criteria for IBRs, but it also, one of the things that the whole point of it was to do post-event analysis and data sharing. So the ISOs and even your transmission operators, they want to see certain things, and you need to be ready to collect this information, especially for new units that are coming on. They really talked about how I read through the implementation plans, and one of the things is that the phase in, they're not, the cost of trying to retrofit certain things and old, like Scott was mentioning, some old technology that they didn't even see this on the horizon. They're not, but if you have a new site going in, you should be forward thinking and thinking about what instrumentation needs to be where. Is it going to be at the point of interconnection? Is it going to be at the step-up transformer? Is it going to be at the inverter? The data sharing has already been happening anyway, and you see that with ISOs, the RTOs, the grid operators. They have been soliciting information anyway. And going forward, there'll be a mandate from this particular standard from a NERC compliance standpoint. So you should be forward thinking about working with vendors like Integ, working with OEMs like and SMA to see where the holes are, the gaps in your data collection and data management.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. All right, so we're gonna move on to 30, and in the interest of time, yeah, just let's go to 30, Adam. And we'll summarize this as well quickly if possible, Sharon.
So quickly, this is that table, and it's covered up with our images, our faces from the what's the name, but that's from MISO, and they had a working group. Basically, they put together this matrix. But with 30, it deals with the unexpected inverter-based resource event mitigation. You want to basically have like a plan of attack, collect operational data during grid disturbances, to identify like the root causes of undesired performance. You want to be able to analyze all your applicable events and document possible mitigating actions. Data sharing, again, is another priority. And that's one of the things with the FERC order, they were really leaning into us working as a collective, the RTOs, all the functional entities working together to make certain that we ride through these grid disturbances and that we collect sufficient data to analyze things. And then the compliance monitoring piece, you want to use the collected data to assess your performance and outcomes, and it's associated with this standard. So that's like it in a nutshell for 30. Scott, I don't know if you want to add.
That's all good. Nothing to add at this time.
All right, so yeah, so really IEEE, what to expect from the ISO and grid operators. Scott, was this your slide? I forget.
I don't think it was mine, but I'm happy to speak for it unless.
Yeah, if you could just
author
summarize
wants to.
very quickly, yeah.
So this is coming back to early adoption of 2800 and making sure you're looking at the interconnection requirements, you're looking at the performance requirements, the capability requirements of your plans, as well as the ride-through, the fault ride-through, the voltage ride-through, the frequency ride-through, enhancing the support, clearing the fault ride-through, and improving the coordination. And this is all happening through the standards. It's the whole point of the standard. Some people are, again, doing early adoption of certain sections. So it all comes back to making sure you're checking your LGIAs.
All right, great. Thank you for that. All right, let's move on, Ab. So yeah, great conversations. We're running a little bit behind, but it's not a problem. So with all that said, the thing is, okay, what's the action plan, right, for generator owners to say, okay, what are we doing? I know there's still a lot of things in the air, but this is kind of just a high level summary for everyone. So let's move on, Adam. All right. So again, we all recognize you're going to basically have to satisfy many different folks. You've got the ISOs or grid operators, RTOs, whatever you want to call them. You've got NERC, you've got, other regional entities and regulators. I'll just keep that as other because we can get into that in detail, but just, whatever the case is, the current practices, best practices are not sufficient. So there will be a world of change coming, and this is just to kind of allude to that. Let's move on. So the process, right, is going to be number one, identify the gaps. Where are the gaps? Are they in data collection? Are they infrastructure, process and security? In infrastructure, I'm throwing software in there as well. Then you're going to have to say, okay, now based on these gaps, what are going to be the requirements? Okay, how do I have to improve my modeling, planning, disturbance monitoring, data sharing with the ISOs, and that goes into the software, as well as IT infrastructure or other infrastructure if needed for collection. And then step 3 is going to be implementing the solutions, right? Any automated collection, any improvements that are required, IT infrastructure improvement, OEM improvements, if you need, if you can't collect and you have to collect certain things, and then updated standard operating procedures and security, right? I think like what Carlos said is that this has to be holistic. This has to be well thought out. Gone are the days where you could just at the end say, hey, let's look at everything that happened and send the audits and evidence. It's going to be way more real time, way more proactive, and it will involve way more people. So that's kind of the gist of it. I don't know if anybody has anything to add, but kind of what we're doing, right, is that where possible, we're capturing everything. We're capturing all the data, all the sensor data, OEM data. And I say OEM because, there's other sensor data that's non-OEM as well that's going to be needed. And then we try to do everything as near real time as possible, because if there's a risk or compliance event happening, well, log everything you need automatically, right? We have AI and can do all these things, but there's still a bunch of stuff that's manual, right? You tell people, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that. Make sure those folks do that. If not, you can alert a supervisor, right? So there's a human aspect that we have to make sure we control as well. So we're designing the software with this in mind to say, hey, do everything automated, but where it's manual, tell people what to do. Because right now, they're not going to go look at a software and click, 100 buttons or check things, right? You really have to kind of tell them what needs to be done now. And that's what we're finding. And it's a new way of thinking for us as well. So we then initiate workflows for whatever the standard operating protocol for that company is. And as Carlos kind of alluded to, this is important. You have to understand what your program is going to be and make sure it works for the entire organization. And where possible, all the evidence is recorded for audit, and it may be some of the stuff that logs that manual folks filled out, or it may be just automated evidence. And then it's for after the fact submissions. You're going to have a bunch of different submissions to NERC, ISO, et cetera, that we see upcoming. But also, if an inquiry comes, you have all of that data and that story's there, right? Because with IBRs, it's too much data. You're not going to be able to go back. If you do, you're going to need tons of time each time this happens. So we're kind of designing for that world. And if you're doing your own systems, this is a great kind of way to do it. And so, yeah, let's move on. Sorry, Adam. So this is kind of oversimplified. You're going to start with the OEM. If you need data, you're going to require it, capture it. And most important, data storage and retrieval are important, right? To do all of this, if you don't have a central repository or historian, we're able to get to the data, the OEMs will hold the data for a certain time, but after that, that gets overwritten, right? But to grab all the data, everything, you're really going to need these types of systems, right? So start with the equipment and make sure that you capture the data and you can get it to some sort of central repository. Let's go to step 2. And then I think, Scott, you talked about this before. A lot of this now is also going to be, everything may not be required at the inverter level, but you're going to need unit level, substation, POI level, where you're going to need more sensors to capture additional data, right? So that's going to be important. And the same point, as you add those sensors, you're going to have to make sure that you can do data storage and retrieval for those as well. So
may I chime in here too?
Sure.
So there's another benefit to working with a vendor who has kind of a comprehensive data management, data analytics, and that is that that there are other standards that are triggered by certain events like PRC4 and misops and operations. So if you're capturing certain information for compliance with these particular standards that are coming down the pipe, you're also going to be gathering. It's not like separate, it's enterprise. You're capturing your misops, your operations of your your relays, your protection systems that you have to report quarterly too. So the data management piece of this is huge because I see so many areas where you're already required to comply with reporting. Well, you have reporting requirements that help you. This helps those things as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Sharon. So, all right, step 3, Carlos, I'm going to let you take over on this, and this is going to be more security, and this is uber critical.
Yeah, so and Sharon, made a good point there, where, a lot of these standards are connected, and, my call to action for, those folks on the phone and the messaging that you can bring back to your respective teams is, as we are operating the grid, we got to make sure we stay secure, we stay reliable. It needs to really be embedded in everything that we do. So, making sure that we stay cyber aware, first and foremost, as we're operating towards our processes. We think about, the scope of IBRs and how, where it can be connected potentially with, some of our areas on the low impact requirements for SIP3. And you start to peel back what, really the essence, the overall intent of SIP3 is, which is really to help layer in controls both on the physical and electronic side with respect to operating the grid within those low impact areas. The ERO just published a really great report that's referenced there in the third bullet. We can always put a link in the chat for you guys to reference it if you need it. But encourage all to take a look at it. Has some top 4 risk themes, if you will, that are called out and of interest that I saw in there that I wanted to share with the team here. It's around the usage of TCAs, especially in the low impact space, and understanding that, given that the fact that the requirements are not necessarily as prescriptive, there's been, a variety of different cases where folks have had fall downs in this area from a compliance perspective and not necessarily, plugging in these devices into OT equipment in the most cyber aware manner. Everything, you'll see it in the report, everything's from not understanding really what the requirements are, not understanding the risks associated with plugging in a transient cyber asset into an OT device. And what I took away from that report that I also wanted to make sure you guys, just give some thought to as you go back to your teams is really to have a comprehensive program centered around how you're interacting with these OT devices out in the field. We talked a lot about gathering data, and that requires oftentimes either some sort of automation or human intervention where you're plugging into a device. So having a comprehensive program, understanding what your TCA inventory is. A lot of times what I'll see out in the field is where people have broadened the scope of what they're allowing to be plugged in and what they're allowing to be included as a part of their TCA inventory. So really understanding, what is your subset of TCAs that you're allowing to plug into the grid to operate on a daily basis. Understanding what your low impact bed cyber systems are, and which ones are most critical to the grid and which fall into scope of your programs. Although we're not required to have a list per se of low impact devices, it's rather hard to apply some of these standards and requirements without having, an inventory of those devices that are most critical to us. So inventory of TCAs, having a comprehensive program around how we're using TCAs and managing TCAs. And then lastly, really understanding what is your inventory of low impact bed cyber systems? Because, if I had a crystal ball and if I were a betting man, the requirements in the low impact space will continue to grow and become more stringent, a la the, medium impact and high impact requirements. So NextEra, for example, we're already making, programmatic changes where possible to apply some of the medium impact requirements, just to kind of get ahead of some of the risks that we're seeing throughout the industry.
That's a great synopsis. Thank you, Carlos. All right, so we only have about 3 minutes left. Yeah, if you want to just talk to this, and then I can kind of finish up.
So, this frosty goop, I sat in on a Drago's industry briefing on this particular malware, and it's pretty disturbing. Because like Carlos just said, you know, on the sites typically tend to be a low impact sites, and the medium impact comes into play with your control centers. But the reality is that because the removable media, the data, pulling the data, and I don't believe this is a problem for SMA, but some of the inverter manufacturers, sometimes you got to go in and grab information. And one of the ways that you grab it is to basically plug in with a finger drive. That's the whole point of the step 3, the removable media and the transient cyber assets. The rules is to control like who's plugging in. And at these sites, they're usually in remote places. People will need to get the data. The great part about Integ is that they're like helping you gather that data. So I'm kind of jumping around, but this frosty malware targets the Modbus communication protocol. And if you are literally in the process of trying to lock your site down and you still have these competing interests for data collection, there's this inherent risk of introducing certain having someone exploit some of your vulnerabilities. So like Carlos just said, you want to lock your stuff down. You want to know for certain that your OT network is as secure as your IT network. And you want to make certain that if you're moving data, you're moving it in the most secure and most secure way possible. And if you're moving it with a finger drive, you're opening up a can of worms. And if you're sending it through SCADA, you got to be mindful of how you're communicating, moving your data.
Right.
So these are all, if you don't have a medium impact posture at a low impact site, Carlos just pointed out, you got to know certain things, even though they don't mandate it. You got to have an inventory. You got to do it anyway. So just kind of assume the posture of a medium impact site, even though you only have a low impact mandate. That's my personal preference.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So yeah, so we're kind of exactly at the 1 o'clock mark. Sharon, Scott, Carlos, thank you so much for your insight and adding to this. Unfortunately, we don't have time for the Q&A, but you guys can just message us on LinkedIn, and any questions you have, we'll get them answered for you. So just anything, don't worry about it. We'll get to the right folks, and we'll get back to you if you do have any questions. And we will be following up with a copy of the webinar and a summary of everything. So thank you very much, everyone. Adam, did you have anything to add before we go?
Just a note, if you need any more chat with Amit, actually, when you log off, it will redirect you to somewhere to book a call to talk with Amit and I about kind of what we're doing with our platform and how it can help. So if you wanted to see that, as we mentioned earlier, you can either email us, message us on LinkedIn, or when you log off, there'll be an option to just schedule a call if that's something you're interested in.
All right. Perfect. Thanks, everyone. And again, yeah, if you need to get in touch with anyone else as well, just let me know, shoot us a message, and it could be anything, any question, doesn't have to be related to software. We'll be happy to help and get you answers. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.